In this video, I'm going to give a quick overview of some of the safe space policies, particularly those that impact the intake center. All policies and procedures are found in the intake center binder. Please review them when you have a chance and talk to any of the shelter operations managers if you have any questions regarding these. Let's start with the policy regarding who gets admitted to safe space. Safe space is a low barrier shelter, but guests are expected to meet minimum criteria for admission. We do not do drug or alcohol testing. We do not require identification. We do, however, require that all guests agree to follow the rules and that they do so. Safe space, as a general rule, is not a good fit for minors, for families with children, or for those with severe mobility issues, but exceptions can be made by the shelter operations manager. Guests must be able to care for themselves, and that includes the ability to physically transfer to a cot or bed, to use the bathroom without assistance, to use safe space transportation, and to eat without assistance. All guests must register through the intake center. Anyone who shows up directly at the shelter will not be admitted unless it's been prearranged and approved by the shop team. This would occur in special circumstances such as a confirmed job or school schedule, and for guests who volunteer to help with setup, particularly on our move-in day. To be allowed to stay at safe space, guests must agree to follow the code of conduct. And while pets are allowed, they too must comply with minimum safety criteria. Any animals must be able to stay under the control of the owner. They must not growl or make other threats to either people or other animals. Safe space does not discriminate in its services on the basis of race, color, religion, creed, gender, gender expression, age, national origin, ancestry, marital status, sexual orientation, or military status in any of our activities or operations. As I said, guests must sign the code of conduct. This takes place during their initial intake, and these rules are also posted both at the intake center and at the shelters. Guests must acknowledge that safe space is a zero tolerance zone for violence. That includes verbal or physical. That means no bullying, threats, teasing, shoving, pushing, hitting, or damaging property. Also, no alcohol, illegal drugs, or weapons that are not placed in the belongings bag and handed over at intake to be stored overnight. There are no exceptions to this. Guests must agree to follow all the safe space rules, to comply with directions given by safe space volunteers, and again, to give up their personal property for overnight storage, including any or all alcohol, illegal drugs, or weapons. Guests must acknowledge that noncompliance with these rules may result in them being excluded from the shelter. The goal of safe space is to provide a safe and peaceful living environment and to treat everyone with respect, dignity, courtesy, and honesty. We truly do not want to exclude anyone. It's our last resort. However, guests and potential guests may be excluded for violation of the rules where their violation is placing other people at risk. Exclusion or ejection can be based on, or that is based on a violation of the rules, is determined by the shelter operations manager. And you should know that these are regularly discussed by the shop team. We really make an effort to make sure that we're being both reasonable as well as consistent in how these rules are enforced. The shelter operations manager may give a one-time warning prior to excluding a guest, but as a general rule, guests will be excluded for 7 days for first offenses such as possession of drugs or illegal alcohol, either at the intake center after property storage or at any shelter site. Also for any form of physical or verbal threat towards guests or volunteers, and for minor hands-on physical assault that's like shoving, pushing, or grabbing. Major physical assault, hitting, kicking, biting, will result in a 30-day exclusion. Exclusions are doubled for a second offense, and a third offense can result in exclusion for the rest of the season. Guests who have been excluded can be readmitted. They must meet with one of the shelter operations managers who will make a decision regarding readmission, and any person who is readmitted must again sign the code of conduct. Services for minors. Generally, Safe Space will only serve people who are 18 or older, but there are exceptions to this. Any exception must be approved by the shelter operations manager, and that will be based on both the circumstances and the needs of the individuals. We may receive requests for shelter from adults who are accompanied by minor children or by unaccompanied minors. Parents with minor children should be provided shelter like any other guest, and if a family registers at intake, the shelter operations manager should notify the evening team leader. The evening team leader should place the family's bedding in a place that is, to the extent possible, separate from other guests and in sight of the shelter crews. The presence of this family should be passed on to later shelter shifts, and parents are responsible for any decisions regarding their children within Safe Space rules. They must ensure control of their children. Any problems with families with kids should be logged, and shelter volunteers should all be attentive to any red flags regarding neglect, abuse, or other issues. These should be reported to the shelter operations manager, and if appropriate, will be reported to appropriate authorities. We rarely get requests for shelter from unaccompanied minors, but it has happened and could happen again. The decision of whether to provide shelter to an unaccompanied minor will be made by the operations manager, and this person should first determine if the minor is willing to be referred to the Homeless Emergency Action Response Team. That's HEART. HEART serves minor homeless youth. It has 24-hour mobile crisis intervention, access to temporary shelter, social services advocacy, counseling, family reunification, and support with basic issues such as food, clothing, and hygiene items. The 24/7 phone number for HEART is programmed into Safe Space phones. If HEART is unable to help, or if the minor is unwilling to make this referral, the shelter operations manager may allow the minor to stay based on a judgment that it's in the best interest of the minor. Other factors will come into play, such as weather conditions, other safety conditions, and lack of alternatives. If shelter is to be provided to an unaccompanied minor, the shelter operations manager will notify the evening team leader, and again, the bedding area will be set up to the extent possible separate from other guests and within the area that monitors can watch over the minor. In the next video, we're going to talk more about general administrative issues.